There's a fascinating slate of college basketball action on Saturday, January 27th. We'll jump right into the action. We'll take a look first at a couple of Big 12 SEC Challenge games, the earlier games in the day. South Carolina at home against the Texas Tech Red Raiders. The Gamecocks a 2.5-point underdog in this one. Texas Tech hasn't looked great over their last 3 games. Yes, they did get by Oklahoma State this week, but they trailed for a large portion of that game. South Carolina, meanwhile, beat Florida this week, Kentucky last week. I like South Carolina to upset Texas Tech on Saturday. The next game in the challenge we're going to look at, Baylor heading into Gainesville to play the Florida Gators. Baylor is a 6.5-point underdog. And on the season, the Baylor Bears are 2-6 over their last 8 games. I think that could be an issue. Baylor does have a really good defense that could possibly give Florida trouble, but I just think Florida makes their shots in this game, especially at home. Gators find a way to get past Baylor, but I expect a close game. Gators by 5 over Scott Drew and the Baylor Bears. Jumping ahead now to the ACC, NC State going into Chapel Hill to play the North Carolina Tar Heels. The Tar Heels a 12-point home favorite. NC State kind of had a little mojo, but they haven't looked great over their last couple of games. Specifically, Al Freeman has not been the same offensive player he was when they beat Duke back earlier this month. And against the North Carolina team that plays decent defense and good offense, I think that could be a sign of trouble for the Wolfpack. Personally, I have to go with North Carolina at home. I think the Tar Heels win by 15 over NC State. Jumping down to the Pac-12, the best game probably out west of the day is probably Stanford at UCLA. The Bruins are a 6.5-point home favorite. We did pick UCLA to beat Cal and cover the 14 on Thursday night. Unfortunately, Cal with a late dunk to cut the lead from 15 to 13, and the Bears ended up covering. But this one is only 6.5. I think it's more manageable. Remember, Stanford's big Pac-12 wins that they've had all came at home. This is on the road. And including those wins, Stanford did beat UCLA in a double overtime game at home. But again, this one in Westwood, I have to go with the Bruins, and I personally think UCLA wins this one by 9. Jumping back to the ACC now, Florida State hosting the Miami Hurricanes, the Seminoles a 4.5-point favorite. A key in this game to me is, can Florida State replicate what they did? Even though they lost against Miami earlier in the season, that game was in Miami, but in that game, and what I want to see them replicate in this one, is they forced Miami to play at the tempo they wanted. I think if they can do that, especially in Tallahassee, it's going to spell trouble for the Hurricanes. I think these are two very, very similar teams in terms of talent, in terms of what they've been this season. I think Florida State playing at home, and I have to believe they'll be able to replicate the tempo they played with at the first matchup. I have the Seminoles winning this one by 6. Now we go back to the Big 12 SEC Challenge for another big game there. Texas A&M heads to Allen Fieldhouse to play the Kansas Jayhawks. The Jayhawks, a 7-point home favorite. Texas A&M hasn't looked good during SEC play. Kansas, I know they're 9-2 and they have those 2 home losses, but A&M has been miserable away from home this season. They've lost, I think their four road losses have come by an average of something like 12 points per game in those 4 losses. That's not what you want going into Kansas. You know the Jayhawk faithful will be fired up for a late afternoon, early evening tip-off from Lawrence. And I have to go with the Kansas Jayhawks with that home crowd behind them, beating a Texas A&M team that had a lot of hype, but is slowly starting to struggle. Although I still like A&M as a team that could maybe make some noise in the tournament, Jayhawks by double digits over the Aggies. Going to stay in the challenge, Oklahoma heads to Tuscaloosa to take on the Crimson Tide of Alabama. Trae Young, Colin Sexton, a fascinating matchup between 2 likely top 10 picks in next June's draft. Oklahoma hasn't been great away from Norman this season. Meanwhile, Alabama perfect in Tuscaloosa throughout SEC play so far. However, if Oklahoma can do what they did against Kansas, Trae Young, move the ball around, don't force shots, get the other guys involved, the other guys hit their shots. That's a lot to ask of them, but they did it against Kansas, and I think they replicate that type of performance against Alabama. It's a 1-point Sooners favorite. I have Oklahoma winning this one by 6 or 7 points. It's going to be a good game, but I like Oklahoma to pull it out. Now, we head on to our 5-star matchups of the evening. There's 2 of them. Remember, our 5-star matchups track which games we feel will have a huge impact on who we perceive as favorites come March. The first matchup, Kentucky heads to Morgantown. They'll take on West Virginia. The Mountaineers are a 6.5-point home favorite. West Virginia, the loss to TCU on Monday. Kentucky, the win over Mississippi State on Tuesday to snap the 2-game skid they had after losses to South Carolina and Florida. What do I expect in this game? This is still a very young Kentucky team. West Virginia, although they struggled against TCU, many people think they've kind of lost some of that luster they had earlier in the season. This is a home game for them. They're going to be using the press against an inexperienced Kentucky team, as we just mentioned. I think that plays into their hands. However, I expect Kentucky's young kids to come out fired up with a little something to prove. A lot of people, they're not in the top 25. A lot of people writing them off a little bit in terms of a contender in the season. I think Kentucky with something to prove comes in. It's a very, very competitive game. Down to the last minute, I think. West Virginia just finds a way to win. I have the Mountaineers by 3. And then the game of the weekend, one of the best games of the season I anticipate, the Virginia Cavaliers ranked 2nd in America. The Duke Blue Devils ranked 4th. A huge top 5 showdown from Durham. It's an interesting clash of styles here as Virginia comes in with an elite defense, Duke an elite offense. I expect this game to unfold with both teams throwing haymakers at each other. A very, very good game, strength on strength. But at the end of the day, with Duke playing at home in front of the Cameron Crazies, I have to give a slight edge to Duke. But make no mistake about it, these are 2 of the very, very best teams in America. I like Duke, though, over Virginia by 2 points in a thrilling game in Durham to cap off a wild Saturday of college hoops.